Hey guys, tonight we're exploring a story that everyone in history should know. The story is Napoleon's Exile, history's greatest escape. You get comfortable, take a moment, like the video, and subscribe, but only if you genuinely enjoy what I do here. And let me know in the comments where you're tuning in from and what time it is for you. It's always fascinating to see who's joining us from around the world. Now, dim the lights, maybe turn on a fan for that soft background hum, and let's ease into tonight's journey together. Napoleon's Exile, history's greatest escape. History is filled with stories of kings who rose to unimaginable heights before disappearing into obscurity after defeat. Most of them vanished quietly, remembered only in dusty records and fading monuments. Napoleon Bonaparte was different. Even after losing an empire that stretched across much of Europe, he refused to accept that his story had come to an end. His greatest battlefield was no longer a vast plain covered with soldiers and cannons. Instead, it became a tiny Mediterranean island where the most dangerous man in Europe was expected to spend the rest of his life in peaceful isolation. The governments of Europe believed they had solved the Napoleon problem once and for all. After years of war, countless battles, and unimaginable loss, they had finally forced the Emperor of the French to surrender his throne. They allowed him to keep his title, but they stripped away almost everything else that had made him powerful. His armies were gone. His empire had collapsed. His allies had abandoned him. His enemies celebrated what they believed was the end of an extraordinary era. They sent him to Elba, a small island lying between the French and Italian coasts. It was barely large enough to support a modest population, let alone the ambitions of a man who had once ruled millions. The island measured only a few miles across. European diplomats considered it the perfect prison. Napoleon would have enough comfort to preserve his dignity, but not enough freedom to threaten anyone again. They could not have been more mistaken. To understand why Napoleon's escape became one of history's most astonishing events, it is necessary to understand the man himself. He was not simply a military commander. He possessed an almost unmatched ability to recognize opportunity where everyone else saw defeat. Every setback became another problem, waiting to be solved. Every apparent disaster contained the possibility of victory. Napoleon Bonaparte was born on August 15th, 1769, on the island of Corsica. His birthplace had only recently become part of France, and many Corsicans still considered themselves separate from the mainland. His family belonged to the minor nobility, respectable but far from wealthy. Nothing about his childhood suggested that he would one day dominate Europe. As a young boy, Napoleon often felt like an outsider. His Corsican accent made him the target of ridicule at French military schools. Many of his classmates came from richer and more influential families. They viewed him as awkward, quiet, and overly serious. Yet every insult strengthened his determination. While others spent their free time socializing, Napoleon buried himself in books. He devoured history, mathematics, philosophy, geography, and military science. He admired the great commanders of the ancient world, especially Alexander the Great and Julius Caesar. Their campaigns fascinated him. He studied not only how they won battles, but also how they inspired loyalty and reshaped entire civilizations. His education taught him something that many commanders never truly understood. Battles were won long before the first shot was fired. Preparation, speed, surprise, and psychological pressure often mattered more than sheer numbers. When the French Revolution erupted in 1789, France descended into political chaos. The old order collapsed almost overnight. Aristocrats fled or were executed. The monarchy crumbled. Institutions that had existed for centuries suddenly disappeared. For ambitious young officers, however, the revolution created opportunities that had never existed before. Promotion was no longer determined entirely by noble birth. Talent suddenly mattered. Napoleon seized the moment. His breakthrough came during the siege of Toulon in 1793. His brilliant use of artillery helped force the British fleet to withdraw, earning him recognition across France. At only 24 years old, he was already attracting attention from the nation's political leaders. What followed was one of the most remarkable military careers in history. During the Italian campaign, Napoleon repeatedly defeated larger Austrian armies through speed, deception, and relentless aggression. His soldiers marched farther and faster than anyone believed possible. They endured hunger, exhaustion, and impossible conditions because they believed in the man leading them. Napoleon understood that armies were not held together by discipline alone, they were held together by belief. He spoke directly to his soldiers before battles, promising glory, honor, and the chance to change history. His speeches were rarely long, but they were unforgettable. He made ordinary men believe they were capable of extraordinary achievements. Victory followed victory. His fame spread beyond France. Across Europe, monarchs watched with growing concern as an ambitious general transformed himself into the most powerful figure on the continent. By 1799, France's government had become unstable and deeply unpopular. Napoleon returned from Egypt and took advantage of the political crisis. Through a carefully organized coup, he became first consul, effectively placing himself in control of France. 5 years later, he crowned himself emperor. The image shocked Europe. Instead of allowing a pope or king to place the crown upon his head, Napoleon lifted it himself. The gesture sent a clear message. His authority came not from ancient traditions, but from his own achievements. Over the next decade, he reshaped Europe. He introduced legal reforms through the Napoleonic Code, reorganized government institutions, modernized education, strengthened the economy, and transformed military organization. Even countries that fought against him later adopted many of his reforms because they proved remarkably effective. Yet military success remained the foundation of his empire. At Austerlitz, often called his greatest masterpiece, Napoleon defeated the combined armies of Austria and Russia, despite appearing to be in a weaker position. His enemies believed they had identified weaknesses in his lines. In reality, they had walked directly into an elaborate trap, The victory established his reputation as one of history's greatest commanders. But empires built on constant conquest carry enormous risks. Every victory created new enemies. Every conquered territory demanded occupation. Every campaign stretched supply lines farther from home. As the French Empire expanded across Europe, maintaining control became increasingly difficult. The first serious cracks appeared in Spain. What seemed like a straightforward intervention turned into a brutal guerrilla war that consumed thousands of French soldiers. Napoleon underestimated the determination of local resistance and the willingness of Britain to support it. Then came the decision that would alter the course of history forever. Russia. In 1812, Napoleon assembled what was arguably the largest army Europe had ever seen. More than 500,000 soldiers crossed the border into the Russian Empire, expecting a decisive campaign that would force Tsar Alexander I to negotiate. Instead, the Russians refused to fight the kind of war Napoleon wanted. They retreated deeper into their vast territory, destroying crops, villages, bridges, and supplies behind them. Every mile Napoleon advanced took him farther from reinforcements and closer to disaster. When French forces finally entered Moscow, they discovered a nearly deserted city. Soon afterward, fires engulfed much of the capital. Napoleon had captured the prize he wanted, but it had become worthless. Winter approached. Food disappeared. Horses died by the thousands. Disease spread rapidly. The retreat from Moscow became one of the greatest military catastrophes in recorded history. Freezing temperatures, starvation, constant attacks, and exhaustion destroyed the Grand Army. The myth of Napoleon's invincibility died in the Russian snow. Across Europe, governments that had once feared him sensed an opportunity. One by one, they united. The coalition armies advanced toward France itself. Napoleon still displayed flashes of military brilliance, winning several remarkable battles, despite overwhelming odds. Yet even genius has limits when faced with exhausted armies, shrinking resources, and an entire continent determined to bring him down. In 1814, Paris fell. For the first time in years, Napoleon found himself facing an enemy he could not outmaneuver. His own marshals urged him to surrender. His political support collapsed. His empire disintegrated before his eyes. At Fontainebleau, Napoleon signed his abdication. To many, it appeared to be the end of one of history's most extraordinary careers. In reality, it was only the beginning of the chapter that would make his legend even greater. Because the tiny island of Elba was not destined to become Napoleon's grave. It would become the starting point for one of the boldest escapes the world has ever witnessed. The emperor of a tiny island. When Napoleon Bonaparte signed the Treaty of Fontainebleau in April 1814, he surrendered the greatest empire Europe had seen since the days of Charlemagne. The document ended more than a decade of dominance and brought the seemingly unstoppable rise of the French emperor to an abrupt halt. To the rulers of Europe, it was a triumph. They had finally accomplished what countless armies had failed to do on the battlefield. Yet even in defeat, Napoleon negotiated better terms than almost any fallen ruler could have hoped for. He was allowed to retain the title of emperor. Although he no longer ruled France, he would still be addressed with the respect due to his former rank. He was granted sovereignty over the small Mediterranean island of Elba, where he would govern its inhabitants and receive an annual income from the restored French government. On paper, it sounded almost generous. In reality, it was exile. Napoleon was only 44 years old. He was in good health, possessed one of the sharpest minds in Europe, and had spent nearly his entire adult life commanding armies, shaping governments, and making decisions that affected millions of people. Asking a man like that to quietly retire on a tiny island was like asking a storm to stop moving. As he prepared to leave France, the journey was far more dangerous than many people realized. The Bourbon monarchy had been restored under King Louis XVIII, and not everyone welcomed the defeated emperor's safe passage. Along the roads leading south, angry royalists gathered in several towns. They shouted insults, threatened violence, and in some places attempted to attack his convoy. For perhaps the first time in years, Napoleon witnessed ordinary French citizens celebrating his downfall. It was a painful reminder that France was exhausted. After more than 20 years of almost continuous war, countless families had lost fathers, sons, and brothers. Heavy taxes, military conscription, and endless conflict had left many people desperate for peace. The country that had once cheered his victories no longer spoke with one voice. Recognizing the danger, Napoleon occasionally disguised himself during the journey. Traveling under a false identity helped him avoid mobs that might have turned deadly. Eventually, he reached the Mediterranean coast. Waiting for him was the British frigate HMS Undaunted. There was something deeply ironic about the moment. For years, Britain had been Napoleon's greatest enemy. British warships had blockaded French ports, financed coalitions against him, and played a crucial role in his defeat. Now it was a British naval captain, Thomas Usher, who would safely escort him to his new home. The voyage across the Mediterranean was calm. Napoleon spent much of the journey speaking with the British officers. They expected to meet a bitter and broken man. Instead, they found someone remarkably composed. He discussed history, politics, literature, and military strategy with ease. He displayed humor, curiosity, and confidence. Several officers later admitted they understood, perhaps for the first time, why so many soldiers had followed him with such unwavering loyalty. On May 4th, 1814, Napoleon arrived at Elba. The island was beautiful. Rocky mountains rose sharply from the sea. Olive trees covered the hillsides. Small villages overlooked crystal clear water. Fishing boats drifted quietly in sheltered harbors. It looked more like a peaceful vacation destination than a prison. But appearances could be deceiving. Elba covered only about 87 square miles. Its population was roughly 12,000 people. Most residents worked in agriculture, fishing, or the island's iron mines. Compared to France, it was almost unimaginably small. Napoleon inspected every corner of his new kingdom with remarkable energy. Within days, he had begun issuing orders. Roads were repaired. Agricultural improvements were planned. Mining operations were reorganized. Schools received attention. Hospitals were inspected. Government offices were restructured. Many islanders quickly realized that their new ruler approached Elba with the same determination he had once devoted to governing an empire. He refused to treat exile as retirement. If Elba was now his country, then he intended to rule it efficiently. He established a miniature court that resembled the imperial household he had maintained in Paris. He wore military uniforms. He held official meetings. He reviewed his small guard force. He rode through villages, speaking with local residents and asking detailed questions about their concerns. To outsiders, it almost seemed absurd. The man who had once commanded hundreds of thousands of soldiers now inspected a military force numbering only a few hundred. Yet Napoleon approached every task with complete seriousness. Routine had always been one of his greatest strengths. Even when circumstances changed dramatically, his habits remained the same. He woke early. He dictated letters for hours. He reviewed reports. He met officials. He planned improvements. He read constantly. His remarkable work ethic survived the collapse of his empire. Still, beneath this appearance of calm acceptance, another process had quietly begun. Napoleon never stopped gathering information. News arrived regularly from France. Visitors came to Elba from different parts of Europe. Merchants carried rumors. Travelers exchanged gossip. Sympathetic supporters found discreet ways to communicate. The island was isolated, but it was not completely cut off. Every piece of information mattered. Napoleon learned that King Louis XVIII faced growing criticism. Many French soldiers disliked the restored Bourbon government. Veterans of the imperial army found themselves ignored or dismissed. Royal officials attempted to reverse some revolutionary and Napoleonic reforms, creating resentment among ordinary citizens. Economic problems continued. Political divisions deepened. The peace many people had expected after Napoleon's defeat failed to arrive. Meanwhile, the victorious powers, gathered at the Congress of Vienna. Their goal was to redraw the political map of Europe and prevent another revolutionary upheaval. Representatives from Britain, Austria, Prussia, Russia, and numerous smaller states negotiated borders, alliances, and spheres of influence. Ironically, while they celebrated Napoleon's removal, they increasingly found themselves arguing with one another. Old rivalries resurfaced. Territorial disputes created tension. Each nation wanted security, but each also wanted advantage. Napoleon paid close attention. He understood politics as well as warfare. The longer Europe's leaders argued among themselves, the less united they became. At the same time, another problem emerged. According to the agreement that had sent Napoleon to Elba, the French government was supposed to provide him with an annual pension. The payments rarely arrived. Whether because of financial difficulties or deliberate political hostility, the money promised in the treaty was delayed. maintaining his household administration and small military force became increasingly difficult. Some historians believe this financial pressure convinced Napoleon that remaining on Elba was becoming impossible. Others argue that he had never intended to stay permanently in the first place. Whatever the truth, one fact became increasingly obvious. Napoleon was thinking far beyond the island. He also noticed something significant about his guards. Although Britain maintained naval patrols nearby, and several European governments watched his activities, the security arrangements were surprisingly relaxed. No one imagined he would actually attempt to escape. Where could he possibly go? France had rejected him. Europe opposed him. His army no longer existed. From the perspective of European diplomats, Napoleon's political career was over. That assumption would become one of the greatest intelligence failures of the 19th century. The emperor carefully observed every ship entering and leaving nearby waters. He studied weather conditions. He evaluated the loyalty of the officers who remained with him. He quietly strengthened relationships with the men who had followed him into exile. Most importantly, he waited. Patience had always been one of Napoleon's underestimated qualities. He understood that successful campaigns depended on timing as much as courage. A premature move would end in disaster. The right moment could change history. As autumn turned into winter, reports from France became increasingly encouraging. Discontent continued to grow. Former imperial officers remained deeply loyal. Many soldiers believed the restored monarchy neither respected nor understood the army that had defended France for years. The legend of Napoleon had not disappeared. It had merely gone silent. Across France, veterans still remembered the victories at Austerlitz, Jena, and Wagram. They remembered the leader who had shared hardships with his troops and rewarded courage regardless of birth. For many, he remained their emperor. Napoleon understood something that his enemies failed to appreciate. Power is not measured only by armies or territory. Sometimes it survives in memory. Sometimes it lives in loyalty. Sometimes it waits for the right moment to return. Standing on the cliffs of Elba, watching the sun disappear beneath the Mediterranean horizon, Napoleon knew that Europe believed it had imprisoned him. He smiled at the thought. Prisons were built to confine ordinary men. He had never considered himself ordinary. And somewhere beyond the sea, an opportunity was slowly beginning to take shape. The plan that Europe never saw coming. By the beginning of 1815, nearly every ruler in Europe believed Napoleon Bonaparte had become yesterday's problem. The great powers were no longer focused on the former emperor living on the island of Elba. Their attention had shifted to the Congress of Vienna, where diplomats and monarchs were attempting to rebuild Europe after more than 2 decades of revolution and war. It was one of the largest diplomatic gatherings the continent had ever seen. Kings, princes, foreign ministers, military commanders, and political advisors filled the palaces of Vienna. Lavish banquets, elegant balls, and endless negotiations became part of daily life. Every nation wanted security. Every government wanted territory. Every ruler wanted assurances that another Napoleon would never rise again. Ironically, while they congratulated themselves on defeating him, they gradually stopped thinking about the man himself. That was precisely the mistake Napoleon needed them to make. On Elba, life appeared calm. Visitors described the former emperor riding through villages, inspecting roads, supervising construction projects, and speaking with local officials. He remained energetic, but nothing suggested he was preparing for another bid for power. The illusion worked perfectly. Napoleon had always understood one of the oldest principles of warfare. The best way to hide your intentions is to give your enemy exactly what they expect to see. Europe expected a retired ruler trying to make the best of his circumstances, so that was exactly the image Napoleon presented. Behind that carefully constructed appearance, however, he was gathering information with extraordinary patience. Messengers arrived from France carrying letters hidden inside clothing, luggage, and even ordinary household items. Merchants brought rumors from the mainland. Former officers quietly visited the island. Some came simply to pay their respects. Others came for a different reason. They wanted to know whether their emperor still possessed the determination that had once carried France across Europe. Every meeting followed a similar pattern. Napoleon asked questions. How popular was King Louis XVIII? What did soldiers think of the restored monarchy? Were ordinary people satisfied? How loyal was the army? Were veterans being treated fairly? How strong was the royal government? He rarely revealed his own thoughts. Instead, he listened. That habit had served him throughout his career. People often assumed Napoleon loved speaking. In reality, many of his greatest decisions came after long periods of careful observation. The reports arriving from France painted a surprisingly consistent picture. The Bourbon Restoration had failed to inspire confidence. King Louis XVIII faced an impossible challenge from the beginning. Many royalists wanted to restore France exactly as it had existed before the Revolution. Others accepted that some revolutionary changes could never be reversed. Former revolutionaries distrusted the monarchy. Old nobles demanded privileges they believed had been stolen from them. Army veterans felt forgotten. Government officials struggled to satisfy competing interests. The result was growing disappointment. People had expected stability. Instead, they found uncertainty. Napoleon understood something that few politicians appreciated. People rarely compare a government with perfection. They compare it with what came before, and despite years of devastating war, many French citizens remembered that under Napoleon, France had been respected, even feared, throughout Europe. That memory still carried enormous power. His supporters became increasingly confident. Letters arriving on Elba often ended with similar phrases. France has not forgotten you. The army remains loyal. Your return would change everything. Napoleon never allowed excitement to replace calculation. He knew that hope alone could not restore an empire. Every successful operation required precise planning. He quietly began evaluating the practical realities of escape. How many men could he trust? How many ships were available? Could they avoid British patrols? Where should they land? Would the French army arrest him or join him? Every question demanded an answer before a single ship left Elba. His personal guard remained fiercely loyal. Many had followed him through years of victories and defeats. They had crossed deserts in Egypt, marched through the snows of Russia, fought in Germany, defended France itself. Exile had not weakened their devotion. If anything, it strengthened it. They believed the emperor had been betrayed rather than defeated. Napoleon also possessed something that many of his enemies underestimated. He understood morale better than almost anyone alive. He knew soldiers fought for far more than money, honor, pride, loyalty, identity. Those emotions often outweighed fear. If he could stand before French troops once more, he believed many would refuse to fire upon him. It was an extraordinary gamble. If he misjudged the mood of the army, the adventure would end almost immediately. He would likely be arrested or killed. Yet Napoleon had built his entire career on calculated risks. This would simply become the greatest risk of all. Meanwhile, British observers continued watching Elba. Their reports generally described ordinary activities. The emperor inspected roads. The emperor attended official meetings. The emperor hosted guests. The emperor reviewed his small guard. Nothing appeared unusual. No one realized that the routine itself had become part of the deception. Napoleon avoided sudden changes. Large military exercises might attract attention. Massive stockpiles of supplies would raise suspicion. Instead, preparations unfolded gradually. Weapons already on the island were maintained. Ships underwent ordinary repairs. Trusted officers quietly discussed possibilities without revealing complete plans. Only a handful of people knew exactly what Napoleon intended. Even among his closest followers, secrecy remained essential. The fewer people who knew the truth, the smaller the chance of betrayal. Timing became the most important factor. Winter weather complicated naval operations. Storms swept across the Mediterranean. British patrols remained active. Napoleon waited. He had learned long ago that impatience destroyed more campaigns than enemy armies. Then fortune intervened. Several British ships temporarily left their usual patrol areas. Some officers believed Napoleon had become harmless. Others assumed poor weather made escape impossible. For a brief period, the waters around Elba became less heavily watched. Napoleon recognized the opportunity immediately. It might never come again. Preparations accelerated. A small flotilla of vessels was quietly assembled. The largest among them, the brig Inconstant, would carry Napoleon himself. Other boats would transport soldiers, horses, supplies, and artillery. The force remained surprisingly small, roughly 1,000 men. Some were veterans of the Imperial Guard, others were Polish lancers. There were grenadiers, artillerymen, sailors, and officers who had refused to abandon their emperor. Against the armies of Europe, the force was almost insignificant. Against history, it would prove sufficient. Napoleon addressed his followers privately. He did not promise easy victories. He did not pretend the mission was without danger. He simply reminded them who they were. Many of these men had spent years accomplishing what others considered impossible: crossing the Alps, winning Austerlitz, surviving Russia, defending France against overwhelming odds. Now they faced one final challenge: return home. Every participant understood the stakes. Failure meant execution. Success meant rewriting history. There would be no middle ground. As February drew to a close, secrecy became even more critical. Loading supplies onto ships had to appear routine. Movements around the harbor were carefully managed. Anyone asking unnecessary questions received vague answers. Napoleon continued behaving exactly as he always had. He reviewed local projects, met officials, inspected guards, received visitors. Nothing suggested that within days he intended to disappear. The deception was so effective that many observers noticed nothing unusual until it was far too late. On the evening before departure, the harbor remained unusually quiet. The Mediterranean reflected the fading sunlight like polished glass. Most of Europe slept peacefully, believing Napoleon remained safely confined on his tiny island. In Vienna, diplomats continued arguing over borders. In Paris, royal officials debated politics. In London, government ministers assumed the greatest threat to European peace had already been solved. None of them realized that only a few hundred miles away, history had begun moving once again. As darkness settled over Elba, loyal soldiers silently boarded waiting ships. Cannons were secured. Horses were led aboard. Supplies were stacked below deck. Officers checked their weapons one final time. There were no cheering crowds, no military bands, no grand farewell, only quiet determination. Shortly before sailing, Napoleon walked through the harbor. He paused to look back at the island that had been both his prison and his refuge. For 10 months, Europe had believed Elba had ended his story. Instead, it had given him something even more valuable: time to think, time to observe, time to wait. Now the waiting was over. Before dawn broke across the Mediterranean, the ships raised their sails. With favorable winds carrying them toward the coast of France, the greatest political gamble of the 19th century had begun. Behind them lay exile. Ahead lay either the restoration of an empire or certain death, the escape that shocked Europe. On the evening of February 26, 1815, Napoleon Bonaparte made the decision that would once again place the fate of Europe in his hands. Without any formal declaration, without warning the governments believed they had imprisoned him, and without firing a single shot, the former emperor quietly slipped away from Elba. It was an escape built not on overwhelming force, but on perfect timing. As darkness settled over the island, a small fleet gathered in the harbor at Portoferrao. The centerpiece was the brig Inconstant, accompanied by several smaller transport vessels carrying soldiers, horses, artillery, and supplies. Altogether, the expedition numbered just over 1,000 men. Compared with the massive armies that had once marched under Napoleon's command, it was almost nothing. Only a year earlier, he had commanded hundreds of thousands of soldiers. Now he was betting everything on barely enough men to fill a village. Yet numbers had never been Napoleon's greatest weapon. Confidence was. As the ships prepared to sail, the atmosphere among the men was strangely calm. There was no loud celebration and no dramatic farewell. Everyone understood the danger. If British warships intercepted the fleet, the mission would end before it truly began. The Royal Navy dominated the seas. For decades, British ships had controlled the world's oceans with remarkable efficiency. Their victories had crippled the French fleet and made large naval operations nearly impossible. Escaping unnoticed through waters patrolled by Britain seemed almost impossible. But impossible had never discouraged Napoleon. Luck, preparation, and careful planning all worked together. Several British ships that normally watched Elba had temporarily moved elsewhere. Some commanders believed Napoleon posed no real threat. Others were occupied with different assignments across the Mediterranean. It created a narrow opening. Napoleon intended to pass through it before anyone realized what was happening. The Inconstant raised its sails. One by one, the remaining vessels followed. Soon the lights of Elba began disappearing behind them. No one knew whether they would ever see the island again. The voyage demanded constant vigilance. British warships could appear at any moment. Merchant vessels might recognize Napoleon and report his position. Unexpected storms could scatter the tiny fleet across the sea. Every hour carried new risks. Napoleon spent much of the journey on deck. Witnesses later recalled that he appeared remarkably relaxed. He spoke with officers, studied maps, and carefully observed the horizon. He showed none of the anxiety one might expect from a man risking everything. Years of command had taught him to remain calm when those around him looked to him for confidence. Fear spread quickly. So did courage. Leaders often determined which emotion prevailed. For several days, the fleet crossed the Mediterranean without encountering serious opposition. The weather remained favorable. The sea stayed relatively calm. Most importantly, no British patrol identified the expedition. It was an extraordinary stroke of fortune. Napoleon later admitted that had a powerful British squadron intercepted his ships, the entire adventure would likely have ended there. On March 1st, 1815, the coastline of southern France finally appeared. The fleet approached the Gulf of Juan, a quiet stretch of coast between Cannes and Antibes. Napoleon deliberately avoided larger ports. Those places contained stronger royal garrisons that might resist his landing. Instead, he chose a relatively isolated beach, where his men could come ashore quickly. As the first boats reached land, history quietly changed direction. There were no welcoming crowds waiting on the beach, no cheering soldiers, no triumphant ceremony. Only a small group of determined veterans stepping onto French soil. Napoleon bent down and picked up a handful of earth. For nearly a year he had been separated from the country he had ruled. Now he had returned. But returning to France was only the beginning. The real challenge lay ahead. Paris was nearly 600 miles away. Between Napoleon and the capital stood the Royal Army. Loyal government officials, police forces, and military commanders sworn to arrest him. His enemies believed he would never survive the journey. In purely military terms, they had every reason to think so. Napoleon possessed roughly 1,000 soldiers. The Bourbon monarchy could mobilize tens of thousands. If even a handful of French regiments chose to fight, the expedition would collapse. Napoleon understood this better than anyone. That was why he intended to wage a campaign unlike any he had ever fought. Instead of defeating French soldiers, he planned to convince them. Instead of relying on artillery, he would rely on loyalty. Instead of capturing cities through siege, he would win hearts through memory. His route north became known as the Route Napoleon. Rather than following the main roads, which contained larger royal forces, Napoleon led his men through the mountainous interior of southeastern France. The journey was exhausting. Steep paths wound through forests and rocky valleys. Supplies remained limited. Every day carried uncertainty. News of Napoleon's landing spread rapidly across France. At first, many people refused to believe it. The reports sounded absurd. How could the former emperor have escaped? How had he crossed the Mediterranean without being captured? Was this simply another rumor? Government officials dismissed the first messages as exaggerations. Then confirmation arrived. Napoleon was indeed in France. The news reached King Louis XVIII in Paris. His ministers reacted with disbelief. Only months earlier, they had accepted Napoleon's exile as a permanent solution. Now the man they believed safely imprisoned was marching toward the capital. Orders spread across the country. Napoleon was officially declared an outlaw. Military commanders received instructions to arrest him immediately. Any officer who joined him would be considered a traitor. On paper, the government's response seemed overwhelming. Thousands of troops stood between Napoleon and Paris. Yet the government faced one problem that could not be measured on military maps. Many of those soldiers had once fought under Napoleon himself. Some had marched beside him for years. Others owed their promotions to his leadership. Nearly all respected his military genius. Would they really fire upon the man who had led them through so many victories? That question haunted every royal commander. Napoleon sensed exactly where the monarchy was weakest. He instructed his soldiers to avoid unnecessary violence. He wanted every encounter with the royal army to become a test of loyalty rather than a battle. If French soldiers refused to shoot, his force would grow stronger with every mile. If they obeyed the king's orders, the adventure would end. Everything depended on the next meeting. As Napoleon's column moved steadily north, villagers gathered to watch. Some stared in astonishment. Others removed their hats in silent respect. Many simply stood speechless. They were witnessing something almost impossible. The emperor had returned. Word traveled faster than Napoleon himself. Messengers rode ahead carrying astonishing news. The eagle has landed. The emperor is marching. Napoleon has escaped. Every town repeated the rumors. Every village added new details. Some stories claimed he commanded 50,000 men. Others insisted an enormous fleet had brought him home. The truth was far simpler. He possessed little more than determination, reputation, and 1,000 loyal followers. Yet those three things proved more powerful than many armies. Each day his confidence increased. So did the anxiety in Paris. Government ministers urged decisive action. Royal officers hurried to intercept the advancing column. Europe's rulers, still gathered in Vienna, received alarming dispatches. At first they struggled to believe them. Had Napoleon truly escaped? If so, how? Who had helped him? What did he hope to accomplish? Within days, disbelief turned into alarm. The man they had exiled less than a year earlier was once again walking across France. The diplomats who had spent months redrawing Europe's borders suddenly realized that their greatest problem had never truly disappeared. He had simply been waiting. Ahead of Napoleon lay one encounter that would determine everything. A regiment of the Royal Army had been sent to stop him. Unlike rumors or political speeches, this confrontation could not be avoided. Within hours, French soldiers would have to make an impossible choice. Would they obey their king? Or would they follow their emperor once again? The answer would decide not only Napoleon's future, but the future of Europe itself. The day an army refused to fire. By the first week of March, 1815, Napoleon Bonaparte had already achieved what many considered impossible. He had escaped from Elba. He had landed safely in France. He had marched north without being captured. But the most dangerous moment of the entire journey still lay ahead. Until now, fortune had favored him. Soon, luck would no longer be enough. His success depended on a single question. Would French soldiers obey the king, or the man who had once led them to victory across Europe? The Bourbon government acted quickly after confirming Napoleon's landing. King Louis XVIII ordered troops to intercept the advancing column before it could gather momentum. The strategy was simple: surround the former emperor, arrest him, and end the crisis before it spread. On paper, it was a straightforward military operation. In reality, it was anything but simple. Many of the officers now serving the restored monarchy had spent years fighting under Napoleon's command. Their uniforms had changed, but their memories had not. They remembered the Italian campaign. They remembered Austerlitz. They remembered Jena. They remembered Wagram. They remembered an emperor who had stood beside them in moments when victory seemed impossible. The government expected discipline to outweigh loyalty. Napoleon believed the opposite. As his small force continued through the mountains, he carefully avoided provoking unnecessary conflict. He instructed his men to maintain strict discipline and to treat civilians with respect. This was not an invasion. It was a return. Every village they entered became another opportunity to demonstrate confidence instead of fear. The people watched with curiosity. Some remained cautious, uncertain of what would happen next. Others quietly welcomed him. Veterans stepped forward from the crowds, removing old military medals that had been hidden away since the Bourbon Restoration. Some saluted, others simply smiled. For them, the emperor had never truly disappeared. Meanwhile, panic slowly spread through the royal government. Each report arriving in Paris seemed more unbelievable than the last. Instead of shrinking, Napoleon's force appeared to be growing. Instead of fleeing, local communities were offering supplies. Instead of resistance, there was hesitation. Officials struggled to understand why their carefully prepared plans were failing. The answer was psychological rather than military. Napoleon was not merely advancing with soldiers, he was advancing with an idea. To thousands of veterans, he represented honor, glory, and national pride. To many ordinary citizens, he symbolized stability during years of uncertainty. Not everyone admired him. Many blamed him for endless wars and unimaginable loss. But even some critics acknowledged his extraordinary leadership. That complicated reality made him far more dangerous than a defeated ruler should have been. On March 7, 1815, everything came down to a single encounter. Near the village of Laffrey, a regiment of the Royal Army blocked the road. Their orders were clear. Stop Napoleon. If necessary, kill him. The soldiers formed a line across the road. Their muskets were loaded. Their officers waited for instructions. Behind them stood the authority of the restored monarchy. Ahead of them marched fewer than 1,000 men. For several tense moments, neither side moved. Silence settled over the valley. Napoleon understood exactly what was happening. One shot could begin a civil war. One mistake could end his life. His officers urged caution. Some suggested preparing for battle. Others recommended retreat. Napoleon rejected every proposal. Instead, he did something almost unimaginable. He dismounted from his horse. Ignoring every warning, he walked forward alone. He approached the line of soldiers without drawing a weapon. His own officers watched in disbelief. So did the royal troops. The distance between the two sides slowly disappeared. Napoleon stopped only a short distance from the waiting muskets. He opened his coat, exposing his chest. Then he spoke. Soldiers, if there is among you a man who wishes to kill his emperor, here I am. No one moved. No one fired. The words hung in the cold mountain air. The soldiers stared at the man standing before them. Many recognized his face immediately. Some had served under him for years. Others had grown up hearing stories of his victories. Now he stood before them alone, placing his life entirely in their hands. The officers shouted commands. Maintain formation. Hold your position. Prepare to fire. But something had already changed. One soldier lowered his musket. Then another. Then another. Within moments, the entire line began to break. Instead of aiming at Napoleon, voices suddenly rose from the ranks. Vive l'Empereur! Long live the Emperor! The cry spread rapidly. Soldiers rushed toward Napoleon, cheering instead of shooting. They embraced former comrades who had arrived from Elba. Officers who moments earlier had prepared for battle now found themselves surrounded by men celebrating the very person they had been ordered to arrest. Without firing a single shot, Napoleon had defeated an army. It became one of the most remarkable moments in military history. No brilliant battlefield maneuver, no devastating artillery barrage, no cavalry charge, only reputation, trust, memory, and extraordinary courage. News of the confrontation spread across France with astonishing speed. Every retelling made Napoleon seem even more unstoppable. Some reports exaggerated the details. Others transformed the event into legend almost immediately. Yet the central fact remained true. The king's soldiers had refused to fire. That single moment shattered the confidence of the Bourbon government. If one regiment could abandon the king, what about the next? And the next? How many could truly be trusted? Napoleon continued marching north. Now his army began growing every day. Veterans left their homes to join him. Former officers returned to his side. Entire military units switched allegiance. The expedition that had landed with barely 1,000 men slowly transformed into a national movement. The psychological balance had shifted completely. Instead of asking whether Napoleon would survive, people began asking whether anyone could stop him. King Louis XVIII desperately attempted to restore order. He issued proclamations declaring Napoleon a traitor. He urged citizens to remain loyal. He promised rewards to those who resisted. But proclamations could not erase years of shared history between Napoleon and the French army. The emperor understood soldiers better than perhaps any ruler of his age. He knew they wanted decisive leadership. He knew they respected courage. Most importantly, he knew they admired leaders willing to share danger with them. His walk toward the loaded muskets became the perfect symbol of that leadership. Whether calculated or instinctive, it demonstrated absolute confidence. Many historians have debated whether Napoleon truly believed the soldiers would spare him. Some argue he carefully judged their loyalty beforehand. Others believe he accepted the genuine possibility of death. Whatever his private thoughts, the gamble succeeded beyond expectation. Europe reacted with growing alarm. Dispatches reached Vienna describing entire regiments joining Napoleon instead of resisting him. Diplomats who had spent months negotiating peace suddenly faced the collapse of everything they had achieved. The defeated emperor was no longer a prisoner. He was becoming a ruler once again. Every mile toward Paris strengthened his position. Every new regiment increased his confidence. Every village welcoming his arrival weakened the monarchy. What had begun as a desperate escape was rapidly becoming a triumph. Ahead lay the capital itself. There, King Louis XVIII faced an impossible decision. Should he remain in Paris and risk capture? Or should he abandon the city before Napoleon arrived? The answer would determine who ruled France. And before Europe fully understood what was happening, the road to Paris was opening before the returning emperor once again. The road to Paris. The encounter at Laffrey changed everything. Until that extraordinary afternoon, Napoleon's return had been little more than an astonishing gamble. He had escaped from exile, landed on the coast of France, and begun marching toward Paris with barely 1,000 loyal followers. Success depended on convincing the nation that his time had not yet passed. After Laffrey, that question no longer seemed uncertain. The soldiers who had been ordered to arrest him had instead sworn their loyalty. The story spread across France with incredible speed. Every messenger carried the same unbelievable news. The king's troops had refused to fire. The emperor was advancing. Entire regiments were beginning to join him. Rumors traveled faster than facts, and with every retelling, Napoleon's army appeared larger than it really was. Some claimed he already commanded 20,000 men. Others insisted that nearly the entire French army had abandoned the Bourbon monarchy. Most of those stories were exaggerated, but they accomplished something just as important. They created momentum. Napoleon understood better than almost anyone that momentum could become a weapon. Once people believed victory was inevitable, many chose to stand with the side they expected to win. Every town along his route watched carefully. Mayors faced impossible choices. Should they resist Napoleon and risk punishment if he succeeded? Or should they welcome him and risk being accused of treason if he failed? Many decided not to resist at all. They opened their gates. Local officials greeted him politely. Food was provided. Fresh horses appeared. Supplies became easier to obtain. Each successful stop made the next one even easier. The march north gradually transformed into something resembling a national procession. Veterans emerged from villages carrying faded imperial uniforms that had been hidden away for nearly a year. Some proudly pinned old medals to their coats. Others brought treasured battle flags they had refused to surrender after Napoleon's abdication. Many had believed they would never again salute the man they had followed across Europe. Now he stood before them once more. Napoleon greeted many veterans personally. He possessed an extraordinary memory for faces and names. Former soldiers were often astonished when he recognized them years after they had last met. A brief conversation with the emperor could inspire lifelong loyalty. He understood that people wanted to feel remembered. That gift became one of his greatest political strengths. Meanwhile, panic steadily grew inside the royal government. King Louis XVIII received increasingly alarming reports from military commanders. Another regiment had changed sides. Another town had welcomed Napoleon. Another official had resigned rather than oppose him. Each report painted the same picture. The government was losing control without fighting a major battle. The king summoned advisors for emergency meetings. Some urged immediate military action. Others recommended negotiation. Several argued that Paris itself should be prepared for a siege. No one could agree on the best course of action because no one fully understood the scale of the crisis. Napoleon was advancing through France with remarkable speed, but he was also advancing through the imagination of the nation. That made him far more difficult to stop. Among the officers ordered to oppose Napoleon was one of France's most respected military leaders, Marshal Michel Ney. Few men possessed greater military prestige. Nicknamed the bravest of the brave, Ney had fought beside Napoleon in many of the empire's greatest victories. He had displayed extraordinary courage in battle and had become one of the emperor's most trusted marshals. After Napoleon's abdication, however, Ney had pledged loyalty to King Louis XVIII. The king believed he could rely on him. When Napoleon landed, Ney publicly declared that he would capture the former emperor and bring him back to Paris in an iron cage. The statement spread rapidly. Royal supporters celebrated. At last they believed Napoleon would face a commander capable of stopping him. Napoleon heard Ney's declaration without visible concern. He simply continued marching north. Privately, he understood something many others overlooked. Loyalty born from fear rarely lasts. Loyalty built through years of shared hardship is much harder to break. Ney faced a conflict unlike any battlefield he had ever known. His duty demanded obedience to the king. His heart remembered years spent fighting beside Napoleon. As reports continued arriving from the countryside, Ney realized the situation was changing faster than anyone expected. Soldiers under his command spoke openly about the emperor. Many admired him. Some hoped to join him. The atmosphere inside the army shifted day by day. Then came the decision that stunned France. After meeting with his officers and assessing the mood of his troops, Marshal Ney abandoned the Bourbon cause. He rode to Napoleon's camp. The two men embraced. Once again, Ney pledged his sword to the emperor. The effect was immediate. If even Marshal Ney had returned to Napoleon, who else might follow? Confidence inside the royal government collapsed. Ministers who had urged resistance now quietly discussed escape. Officials burned sensitive documents. Some packed their belongings. Others attempted to contact foreign governments. Across France, the balance of power shifted almost overnight. Napoleon had not conquered the country through force. He had reclaimed it through loyalty. His army continued growing every day. Infantry units arrived from different. His enemies had underestimated the power of reputation. They had underestimated the loyalty of the French army. Most of all, they had underestimated Napoleon himself. But while Paris celebrated, the rulers of Europe reacted with horror. The news reached Vienna like a thunderclap. The man they believed safely confined to a small island had escaped, crossed France, reclaimed his throne, and driven a king from the capital, all in less than 3 weeks. The peace they had spent months constructing suddenly stood on the edge of collapse. This time there would be no negotiations, no compromise, no second exile arranged by treaty. Europe's monarchs reached the same conclusion almost immediately. Napoleon had returned. And this time they intended to destroy him forever. Europe declares war again. On the evening of March 20th, 1815, Napoleon Bonaparte entered Paris without firing a single shot. The city that had watched him leave in defeat less than a year earlier now welcomed him back as emperor. Crowds filled the streets, cheering as the familiar figure rode through the capital. Imperial eagles appeared once again on uniforms and buildings. Soldiers who had once sworn loyalty to the Bourbon monarchy now saluted the man they had been ordered to arrest. It was one of the most extraordinary political comebacks in history. From the moment he had escaped Elba to the moment he reclaimed the Tuileries Palace, only 20 days had passed. 20 days had been enough to overturn an entire government. Napoleon understood that the celebrations could not last, and the cheering crowds were encouraging, but they did not change one undeniable fact. Every major power in Europe considered him the greatest threat to peace. The rulers of Britain, Austria, Prussia, and Russia had spent years fighting to remove him. They had sacrificed hundreds of thousands of lives, invested enormous sums of money, and built alliance after alliance to end his rule. They were not about to accept his return. Even before Napoleon reached Paris, news of his advance had reached Vienna. The Congress of Vienna had been consumed by arguments over borders and political influence. Diplomats had spent months negotiating, often disagreeing over almost every important issue. Napoleon's return changed everything. Old rivalries suddenly disappeared. The governments that had struggled to cooperate now found themselves united by a single objective: destroy Napoleon. On March 13th, while Napoleon was still marching through France, the representatives gathered in Vienna issued a declaration unlike any before it. They did not merely condemn him, they declared him an outlaw. According to their statement, Napoleon had placed himself outside the protection of international law. He was no longer to be treated as the legitimate ruler of France or even as an ordinary enemy. He was to be hunted, captured, removed forever. The language of the declaration reflected the fear he inspired. Europe's monarchs no longer believed exile was enough. They had tried that once. It had failed. 6 days later, the alliance became even stronger. Britain, Austria, Prussia, and Russia formally agreed to raise massive armies and continue fighting until Napoleon had been permanently defeated. Each nation committed tens of thousands of soldiers. Together, they planned to field nearly 1 million men. It would become one of the largest military coalitions Europe had ever assembled. Napoleon knew exactly what this meant. He had regained France, but he had inherited a race against time. The coalition armies were still scattered across Europe. Many units remained hundreds of miles from the French border. If Napoleon waited, those armies would eventually unite and invade France from multiple directions. He could not allow that to happen. His only realistic chance lay in striking first. Once again, he would have to rely on speed. It was a strategy that had brought him victory many times before. Move faster than the enemy. Concentrate forces before they could combine. Defeat opponents one at a time. The formula was familiar. But circumstances had changed. Napoleon himself had changed. France had changed. Europe had changed. The army he now commanded was not the same grand army that had crossed Europe a decade earlier. Many veterans had died in Spain, Russia, Germany, and France. Others were too old to fight. Thousands had returned to civilian life. New recruits filled many of the ranks. They possessed enthusiasm but lacked experience. Weapons and uniforms had to be distributed quickly. Horses were in short supply. Artillery needed repair. Supply systems had to be rebuilt almost overnight. Napoleon worked with astonishing energy. As always, he seemed capable of functioning with very little sleep. He dictated orders for hours, reviewed military reports, met ministers, inspected troops, studied maps, prepared defensive plans. Visitors often remarked that he appeared almost exactly as he had during the height of his empire. Focused, confident, restless, yet those closest to him noticed subtle differences. The years of war had taken their toll. He tired more easily. His health was less reliable. Moments of fatigue appeared more frequently than before. He remained brilliant, but he was no longer the tireless commander of Austerlitz. Meanwhile, he attempted something many people believed impossible. He tried to convince Europe that he wanted peace. Public statements emphasized that France had no desire for further conquest. Napoleon declared that he accepted the existing borders of France. He promised to respect treaties. He insisted that his only wish was to govern peacefully. Some historians believe these offers were sincere. Others argue they were simply intended to buy time. Either way, the coalition ignored them. For Europe's rulers, the issue was no longer territorial. It was personal. As long as Napoleon remained on the throne, they believed Europe would never know lasting peace. Negotiation was no longer an option. War had become inevitable. Inside France, Napoleon also faced political challenges. Not everyone celebrated his return. Royalists remained loyal to the Bourbons. Republicans feared another dictatorship. Some citizens simply wanted the wars to end. Napoleon recognized that military success alone would not guarantee stability. He announced constitutional reforms designed to reassure those who feared absolute rule. He spoke about liberty, representative government, national unity. Whether these promises reflected genuine political evolution or practical necessity remains a subject of debate among historians. What cannot be debated is the urgency of the situation. Every passing day brought enemy armies closer. British forces under the Duke of Wellington gathered in present-day Belgium. Prussian troops under Field Marshal Gebhard, Leberecht, von Blücher assembled nearby. Russian and Austrian armies marched westward. The trap slowly tightened around France. Napoleon studied the map carefully. If Wellington and Blücher joined their armies before he attacked, the combined force would become extremely difficult to defeat. He needed to separate them, strike one, then the other. It was a familiar strategy, simple in theory, dangerously difficult in practice. Preparations accelerated across France. Blacksmiths repaired weapons. Factories produced uniforms. Cannons rolled toward the frontier. Young recruits hurried through training. Veterans resumed command. Officers who had once believed their military careers were over suddenly found themselves preparing for another campaign. Across Europe, similar scenes unfolded. Prussian soldiers marched toward Belgium. British reinforcements crossed the English Channel. Dutch, Belgian, Hanoverian, and German units gathered under Wellington's command. Supply wagons stretched for miles. Horses were purchased wherever they could be found. Entire nations prepared for one final confrontation. Many hoped it truly would be the last. Napoleon walked among his soldiers before departure. He spoke with officers, inspected equipment. offered encouragement to young recruits who had never fought under his command. Older veterans looked at him with familiar confidence. They had followed him through impossible campaigns before. Many believed they could do so again. But beneath the optimism lay an uncomfortable truth. This campaign would be different from every previous one. There would be no second chance, no negotiated exile, no honorable compromise. If Napoleon won, he might secure his throne once more. If he lost, Europe would never allow him to escape again. Everyone understood the stakes. The campaign that followed would later become known simply as the 100 Days. It lasted little more than 3 months, yet within those 100 days, the future of Europe would be decided forever. As Napoleon rode north from Paris, at the head of his army, thousands of soldiers followed behind him with confidence and determination. Ahead lay Belgium. Ahead lay Wellington. Ahead lay Blücher. And beyond them waited the battle that would decide not only the fate of an emperor, but the destiny of an entire continent. The world was preparing for one final clash with the man who had already escaped history once. This time, history itself would deliver its verdict. The 100 Days begin. By the spring of 1815, Europe stood on the edge of another great war. Napoleon had returned from exile, reclaimed the French throne, and restored the imperial government with astonishing speed. What had seemed impossible only weeks earlier had become reality. Yet beneath the celebrations in Paris, everyone understood the time was running out. The emperor had regained his crown. He had not regained peace. The period that followed would later become known as the 100 Days. Although historians calculate the exact number of days differently, the phrase has come to symbolize Napoleon's final return to power, a brief but unforgettable chapter during which he made one last attempt to preserve everything he had spent years building. From the beginning, Napoleon realized that he faced impossible odds. France had been exhausted by decades of conflict. The treasury struggled to finance another campaign. Factories worked day and night to produce uniforms, muskets, ammunition, and artillery, but rebuilding an empire's military machine could not happen overnight. Every hour mattered. Napoleon threw himself into the work with remarkable determination. He reviewed military reports before sunrise. He dictated letters to ministers throughout the day. He inspected new recruits, questioned engineers about fortifications, and met with political leaders late into the night. Those around him were amazed by his energy. It seemed as though exile had strengthened rather than weakened his resolve. Yet even Napoleon understood that determination alone could not replace experienced soldiers. The grand army that had once conquered Europe no longer existed. The veterans who survived years of relentless warfare were fewer in number. Many had retired. Others had been wounded too severely to fight again. Thousands rested in graves stretching from Spain to Russia. The army now gathering under Napoleon's command was a mixture of seasoned veterans and inexperienced young recruits. The veterans possessed confidence. The recruits possessed enthusiasm. Napoleon hoped the combination would be enough. Meanwhile, across Europe, the coalition powers accelerated their own preparations. Britain's most celebrated commander, Arthur Wellesley, the Duke of Wellington, assembled an international army in Belgium. His force was far from entirely British. It included soldiers from the Netherlands, Belgium, Hanover, Brunswick, and several German states. Many of these troops had never fought together before. Their languages differed. Their training varied. Some units consisted of experienced professionals. Others had little combat experience. Despite these challenges, Wellington trusted his ability to hold the coalition together. Nearby, another powerful army gathered under the command of Field Marshal Gebhard Leberecht von Blücher of Prussia. Blücher was already in his 70s, but age had done little to diminish his fighting spirit. Unlike some European commanders, he deeply respected Napoleon's military brilliance. He also hated him with remarkable intensity. Blücher had suffered defeats at Napoleon's hands before. Now he wanted revenge. Napoleon understood the danger these two armies represented. Separately, each posed a serious threat. Together, they could overwhelm France. His strategy therefore remained clear. Strike before they united. Defeat one army. Turn immediately against the other. It was a strategy he had employed many times during his greatest campaigns. Speed would once again become his greatest weapon. On June 12, 1815, Napoleon left Paris. Crowds lined the streets as he departed. Many believed they were witnessing the beginning of another glorious campaign. Others watched with quiet concern. There was excitement. There was hope. But there was also uncertainty. France had seen too many wars. Too many victories followed by new battles. Too many celebrations followed by mourning. No one could predict how this final campaign would end. As Napoleon traveled north, he spent long hours studying maps. Belgium's roads, rivers, villages, and crossroads became subjects of constant discussion. Every route mattered, every bridge mattered, every hour mattered. The army crossing into Belgium numbered roughly 125,000 men. It remained one of Europe's most formidable military forces. Its cavalry retained much of the confidence that had once terrified enemy armies. Its artillery remained among the finest in the world. Its officers included veterans of countless campaigns. Yet there was one significant difference from earlier years. Napoleon no longer possessed the overwhelming numerical advantage that had often supported his bold strategies. Now he would be fighting against opponents whose combined numbers exceeded his own. The campaign began exactly as he had hoped. French forces crossed the frontier quickly, surprising many coalition commanders. The speed of the advance temporarily separated Wellington and Blücher. Napoleon had achieved the first objective of his plan. Now he needed to exploit the opportunity before his enemies recovered. The first major clashes came almost immediately. French troops seized important positions, while coalition forces rushed to respond. Confusion spread through the Allied command. Reports arrived from different directions, often contradicting one another. Some officers underestimated the size of Napoleon's army, others overestimated it. Communication proved difficult. Roads became crowded with marching soldiers, supply wagons, and cavalry patrols. Napoleon sensed hesitation among his enemies. He intended to move faster. On June 16th, two important battles unfolded almost simultaneously. At Ligny, Napoleon personally commanded the main French army against Blucher's Prussians. Nearby, Marshal Ney confronted Wellington's forces near the crossroads of Quatre Bras. The outcome of these battles would shape everything that followed. At Ligny, Napoleon achieved his final battlefield victory. After intense fighting, the Prussian army retreated. The victory demonstrated that the emperor's military instincts remained remarkably sharp. Even after years of exile and political upheaval, he could still outmaneuver experienced opponents. Yet the triumph contained hidden problems. The Prussian army had been defeated. It had not been destroyed. Blucher himself narrowly escaped capture. Despite heavy losses, his soldiers withdrew in surprisingly good order. That would prove crucial. Meanwhile, events at Quatre Bras unfolded differently. Marshal Ney failed to drive Wellington from the crossroads. The fighting remained fierce, but valuable time slipped away. Napoleon's carefully coordinated plan began to lose momentum. Small delays accumulated. Orders arrived late. Messages became confused. Opportunities disappeared. None of these problems seemed decisive on their own. Together, they became significant. Napoleon still believed victory remained within reach. He ordered Marshal Emmanuel de Grouchy to pursue the retreating Prussians and prevent them from rejoining Wellington. It was an enormous responsibility. If Grouchy succeeded, Napoleon could concentrate his full strength against Wellington alone. If Grouchy failed, the coalition armies might unite. Everything depended on speed. Everything depended on communication. Everything depended on decisions made under extraordinary pressure. As Wellington withdrew toward the small Belgian village of Waterloo, he carefully selected ground that favored defense. The ridge south of the village offered advantages. Its gentle slope concealed many of his troops from French observation. Nearby farms could serve as strong defensive positions. Roads leading north provided a route toward Brussels if retreat became necessary. Wellington studied the landscape with the practiced eye of a veteran commander. He understood that Napoleon would come. He also trusted that Blucher would return. Whether that trust would be rewarded remained uncertain. Rain began falling during the evening of June 17th. By nightfall, the battlefield had become a sea of mud. Roads turned slippery. Fields became difficult to cross. Cannons sank into the soft ground. Horses struggled to move. The weather affected everyone, but it especially troubled Napoleon. French artillery depended upon firm ground to achieve maximum effectiveness. Wet soil absorbed the impact of cannonballs instead of allowing them to bounce through enemy formations. The emperor decided to delay his attack until the ground dried. It appeared to be a sensible decision. No one could know that every passing hour brought the Prussian army closer. As darkness settled over the Belgian countryside, thousands of soldiers prepared for battle. Some cleaned their weapons. Others wrote final letters home. Many tried to sleep despite the rain. Across both armies, men understood they stood on the threshold of an encounter that might decide the future of Europe. For Napoleon, it represented the final opportunity to preserve his empire. For Wellington and Blücher, it represented the chance to end 20 years of war forever. When the sun rose, 3 armies would move toward a small village whose name would become known throughout the world. Waterloo awaited. Waterloo, the last gamble. The morning of June 18, 1815, dawned gray and damp over the Belgian countryside. The heavy rain that had fallen throughout the previous night finally began to ease, leaving the fields soaked with mud. Across the rolling landscape near the village of Waterloo, tens of thousands of soldiers waited in uneasy silence. Few of them knew they were about to witness one of the most famous battles in history. For Napoleon Bonaparte, this was more than another campaign. It was the battle that would decide whether he remained Emperor of France or became a defeated exile once again. There would be no third chance. Across the valley, the coalition army stood under the command of the Duke of Wellington. His soldiers occupied a long ridge stretching across the battlefield. From a distance, it did not appear especially impressive. Yet Wellington had chosen the position carefully. Most of his infantry remained hidden behind the crest of the hill. French artillery could not clearly see many of its targets. Several fortified farms stood in front of the main line, creating strong defensive positions that would force the French to fight for every yard of ground. One of those farms, Hougomont, would soon become legendary. Napoleon rode across the battlefield early that morning, studying the enemy through his telescope. He had commanded armies for more than 20 years. He knew how to read the land. He knew where opportunities existed. He also knew the muddy ground would slow his artillery. That was why he delayed the opening attack. Some of his commanders urged immediate action. Napoleon refused. He wanted the soil to dry enough for cannonballs to bounce across the battlefield rather than sink harmlessly into the mud. It seemed like a reasonable decision. But every hour mattered. Unknown to Napoleon, Field Marshal Blücher's Prussian army was already marching toward Waterloo. The race had begun. Could Napoleon defeat Wellington before the Prussians arrived? That single question would determine the outcome of the day. Late in the morning, the silence finally ended. French artillery opened fire. The thunder of hundreds of cannons echoed across the valley. Smoke drifted over the fields. The Battle of Waterloo had begun. Napoleon's first objective was Hougomont Farm. At first, the attack seemed intended merely to distract Wellington. Instead, it grew into one of the fiercest struggles of the entire battle. French infantry repeatedly stormed the walls. British guards and their allies fought stubbornly from inside the buildings. The farm changed hands in places, but the defenders refused to surrender. Hour after hour, more French troops were committed. What began as a diversion slowly consumed thousands of soldiers. Many historians later argued that the attack became an expensive mistake. Instead of drawing Wellington's attention, it absorbed valuable French manpower that might have been used elsewhere. Meanwhile, the main French assault advanced against the center of Wellington's line. Columns of infantry marched steadily uphill through smoke and cannon fire. They had performed similar attacks successfully in dozens of previous campaigns. But Wellington's army remained disciplined. At the right moment, Allied infantry rose from behind the ridge where they had been sheltered from French artillery. They fired devastating volleys at close range. French formations staggered. Some continued advancing, others hesitated. The fighting became desperate. Neither side gave ground easily. Throughout the afternoon, the battlefield dissolved into confusion. Cannons roared continuously. Musket fire echoed across the fields. Cavalry charged through clouds of smoke. Messengers galloped between commanders, carrying urgent orders. Many never reached their destination. Napoleon remained remarkably calm. Despite the growing chaos, he continued directing operations from positions near the center of the battlefield. He still believed victory was possible. Then came one of the battle's most controversial moments. Marshal Michel Ney, convinced that Wellington's army was beginning to retreat, ordered a massive cavalry attack. Thousands of French horsemen thundered towards the Allied lines. It was one of the most spectacular sights of the entire battle. Steel flashed beneath the afternoon sun. The earth shook beneath charging horses. Trumpets echoed across the valley. But something was wrong. The Allied infantry had not broken. Instead, Wellington's soldiers formed hollow squares, one of the strongest defensive formations against cavalry. Each square presented walls of bayonets pointing outward in every direction. When the French cavalry reached them, they found no opening. Again and again they charged. Again and again they were driven back. Without sufficient infantry support, the cavalry could not break the squares. The attacks achieved remarkable displays of courage. They failed to achieve decisive results. Time continued slipping away. Then shortly after 4 o'clock in the afternoon, Napoleon received the news he had feared. Prussian troops had appeared on the battlefield. At first, only a few units became visible in the distance. Soon more arrived, then more. Blücher had kept his promise to Wellington. Despite the defeat at Ligny 2 days earlier, the Prussian army had marched relentlessly toward Waterloo. Napoleon immediately detached thousands of soldiers to meet the new threat. His army was now fighting in 2 directions at once. Every reserve became precious. Every fresh battalion mattered. Still, the emperor refused to surrender hope. Late in the afternoon, he committed one final reserve: the Imperial Guard. For years, the Imperial Guard had symbolized the strength of Napoleon's empire. These veterans represented the finest soldiers in the French army. They had survived countless campaigns. Their reputation alone inspired confidence among French troops and fear among enemies. Napoleon rarely committed them unless victory or disaster stood close at hand. Now he had no choice. As the Guard advanced, soldiers across the battlefield watched with anticipation. If anyone could break Wellington's line, surely it would be them. The Guard climbed the ridge under heavy fire. They continued advancing with extraordinary discipline. For a few moments it seemed history might repeat itself once more. Then Wellington seized his opportunity. At the critical moment, fresh Allied troops rose from concealed positions and unleashed devastating volleys. The Imperial Guard faltered. They attempted to press forward. The fire intensified. Gradually, the impossible happened. The Guard began to retreat. Someone shouted words that spread across the battlefield with terrifying speed. The Guard is retreating. For years, people had believed the Imperial Guard never retreated. Whether entirely true or not, the legend itself carried enormous psychological power. Now that legend shattered before thousands of witnesses. French morale collapsed. Units that had fought courageously throughout the day suddenly realized victory had slipped away. Retreat turned into confusion. Confusion became panic. As Prussian forces pressed from one direction and Wellington advanced from another, the French army began falling apart. Napoleon attempted to rally his soldiers. He rode among them, urging resistance. Some formations responded. Others had already dissolved into chaos. The opportunity had passed. By evening, the battle was over. The road south filled with exhausted soldiers trying to escape. Cannons were abandoned. Wagons overturned. Thousands of men disappeared into the darkness. Napoleon left the battlefield in silence. Only months earlier, he had escaped from Elba, reclaimed France without firing a shot, and convinced Europe that his legend remained alive. Now, on a muddy Belgian hillside, that legend had reached its final battlefield. Waterloo was more than a military defeat. It marked the end of an era. The dream of rebuilding the French Empire had vanished. The man who had once conquered much of Europe now faced a future with no army capable of protecting him. Yet even after Waterloo, Napoleon's story was not over. One final chapter remained. This time Europe intended to make absolutely certain that he would never escape again. The end of the 100 Days. The defeat at Waterloo did not end with the last cannon shot. As darkness settled over the battlefield on June 18, 1815, thousands of exhausted French soldiers struggled to escape the disaster that had unfolded around them. Roads became crowded with retreating infantry, wounded cavalrymen, abandoned artillery, broken wagons, and frightened horses. The discipline that had once made Napoleon's armies the envy of Europe had collapsed. For many soldiers, survival became the only objective. Napoleon himself left the battlefield before midnight. Throughout his military career, he had experienced setbacks before. He had lost battles, recovered from defeats, and returned stronger than ever. But as he rode south through the darkness, he understood something he had rarely admitted to himself. This defeat was different. Waterloo had not simply destroyed an army. It had destroyed time. The coalition powers would not pause. They would not negotiate. They would not give France an opportunity to recover. The armies of Europe were already advancing. The following day, Napoleon reached Charleroi, where fragments of the defeated French army attempted to regroup. Officers worked desperately to restore order. Some units still maintained discipline. Others had dissolved completely. Men wandered in search of their regiments. Supplies had been lost. Artillery pieces had been abandoned. Communication had broken down. Even so, Napoleon refused to surrender to despair. He believed another army could still be assembled. France still possessed soldiers. Fortresses still stood. The enemy had won a battle, not yet the entire war. But events moved faster than even Napoleon could control. News of the defeat spread across France with astonishing speed. Only weeks earlier, newspapers had celebrated the emperor's triumphant return from Elba. Now they carried reports of disaster. Rumors exaggerated the scale of the defeat. Some claimed Napoleon had been killed. Others insisted Paris would fall within days. Fear spread through the capital. Inside the French government, ministers gathered in emergency meetings. The atmosphere was tense. Many had supported Napoleon's return because they believed his military genius could protect France. Waterloo shattered that confidence. Political leaders now faced an impossible question. Should they continue fighting against the combined armies of Europe? Or should they seek peace before France suffered even greater destruction? Napoleon reached Paris on June 21st. The city greeted him very differently from the triumphant celebrations that had welcomed his return only 3 months earlier. The crowds were smaller, the cheers were quieter. Many people watched in silence. They already understood that another invasion had become unavoidable. Inside the Tuileries Palace, Napoleon immediately met with ministers and military advisors. He argued passionately that France could still defend itself. Fresh armies could be raised. Fortifications could delay the coalition advance. National resistance could change the situation. His arguments reflected the determination that had defined his entire career. He had overcome impossible circumstances before. Why not again? But this time, many of the people around him no longer believed. Years of continuous warfare had exhausted the nation. The treasury stood nearly empty. Political divisions had deepened. Most importantly, confidence had disappeared. The Chamber of Representatives, France's elected legislative body, refused to grant Napoleon the extraordinary powers he requested. Many deputies feared another dictatorship. Others believed continued resistance would only invite greater catastrophe. For the first time in years, Napoleon discovered that military authority alone could no longer shape France's future. Politics had become the battlefield he could not dominate. Pressure mounted rapidly. Several influential ministers advised him that only one option remained: abdicate. Napoleon resisted, he argued, he negotiated, he searched for alternatives. Yet every hour brought new reports of coalition armies crossing the French frontier. The military situation deteriorated steadily. On June 22, 1815, only 4 days after Waterloo, Napoleon Bonaparte abdicated for the second time. The announcement carried enormous historical weight. His first abdication in 1814 had been followed by exile and an astonishing return. This second abdication felt different. Even Napoleon recognized that Europe would never repeat its earlier mistake. Before stepping aside, he attempted one final political move. He declared his young son, Napoleon II, as Emperor of the French. The boy, however, remained in Austria with his mother. He never exercised real authority in France. The declaration changed nothing. The coalition powers had already decided that no member of Napoleon's family would be allowed to rule. A provisional government quickly assumed control in Paris. Its leaders hoped to negotiate favorable peace terms before coalition forces reached the capital. Napoleon withdrew to the Château de Malmaison, the country estate closely associated with his first wife, Josephine. The house held countless memories. Years earlier, it had been a place of celebration, ambition, and happiness. Now it became a place of reflection. Visitors found Napoleon unusually quiet. He spent long hours walking through the gardens. Sometimes he spoke about past campaigns. Sometimes he remained silent for extended periods. He still hoped to escape France. One possibility remained: America. The United States lay beyond the reach of European monarchies. Several supporters suggested that Napoleon sail across the Atlantic and begin a new life there. The idea appealed to him. He instructed trusted officials to prepare for departure. False identities were discussed. Ships were examined. Routes were considered. For a brief moment, another extraordinary escape seemed possible. But circumstances had changed dramatically since Elba. British warships now maintained a tight blockade along the French coast. The Royal Navy watched every major port. Every vessel leaving France attracted attention. Finding a way through the blockade would prove extraordinarily difficult. Napoleon traveled toward the Atlantic coast, hoping an opportunity might still appear. He eventually reached Rochefort, where he waited anxiously for news. Each day brought disappointment. British patrols remained vigilant. No safe route emerged. Time continued running out. Coalition armies advanced steadily across France. Paris surrendered without major resistance. The war had effectively ended. Napoleon now faced one final decision. Should he attempt a desperate escape through the blockade? Should he surrender to advancing Prussian forces? Or should he place himself in British hands? It was an extraordinary choice. Britain had been his greatest enemy for nearly 20 years. Yet Napoleon believed British law and tradition offered the best hope of fair treatment. He compared himself to the ancient Greek hero Themistocles, who had sought protection from a former enemy. On July 15, 1815, Napoleon boarded the British warship HMS Bellerophon, standing before Captain Frederick Maitland. He declared that he had come voluntarily. He requested asylum. He hoped Britain would allow him to live peacefully as a private citizen. For a brief moment it seemed possible. British officers treated him with courtesy. Many admired the remarkable man now standing before them. Curious spectators gathered along the English coast, hoping to catch a glimpse of the legendary emperor. Newspapers eagerly reported every detail. Across Britain, fascination often outweighed hatred. Even many former enemies acknowledged his extraordinary place in history. Napoleon himself remained cautiously optimistic. Perhaps his years of war had finally come to an end. Perhaps Britain would allow him to settle quietly in the English countryside. Perhaps he would spend the rest of his life writing his memoirs. He could not know that far away in London, the British government had already reached a very different conclusion. Elba had taught Europe a painful lesson. No prison close to the continent was secure enough. If Napoleon remained anywhere within easy reach of France, another escape might always be possible. This time they intended to choose a prison from which no return could ever be imagined. An isolated island in the middle of the South Atlantic. A place farther from Europe than almost anyone could comprehend. Its name was Saint Helena, and unlike Elba, it would become Napoleon Bonaparte's final destination. The island of no return. When Napoleon stepped aboard the British warship Bellerophon on July 15, 1815, he believed he was making the wisest choice available. He had surrendered voluntarily. He had not been captured on the battlefield. He had not attempted to flee under a false identity. Instead, he had placed himself under British protection, hoping to be treated as a political refugee rather than a prisoner. For a brief period, that hope seemed reasonable. Captain Frederick Maitland treated Napoleon with courtesy and respect. The former emperor was allowed to move freely around parts of the ship, dine with the officers, and converse with those who were eager to meet one of history's most famous military leaders. Although Britain had spent years fighting against him, many British officers found Napoleon to be intelligent, thoughtful, and surprisingly approachable. He spoke about history with remarkable detail. He discussed military strategy as though reviewing a chess match rather than decades of bloody conflict. He asked questions about Britain, its navy, and its people. The conversations often lasted for hours. News of Napoleon's arrival spread rapidly throughout England. As Bellerophon anchored near the coast, hundreds of small boats crowded around the warship. People came from nearby towns simply to catch a glimpse of the man whose name had dominated Europe for nearly 20 years. Some climbed rooftops. Others hired fishing boats. Many brought telescopes. The excitement resembled the arrival of a legendary figure rather than a defeated enemy. For ordinary Britons, Napoleon had become a living piece of history. Many expected the government to allow him to settle somewhere in Britain under careful supervision. Some suggested a country estate. Others imagined a quiet retirement where he could write books about his extraordinary life. Napoleon himself believed something similar. He hoped to live peacefully as a private citizen. The days of commanding armies, he admitted, had finally ended. He had no desire to begin another war. But while curiosity filled the British public, government ministers viewed the situation very differently. Prime Minister Lord Liverpool and his cabinet remembered Elba. They remembered how Europe had celebrated Napoleon's first exile. They also remembered how quickly that celebration had turned into panic after his escape. No one wished to repeat the same mistake. Allowing Napoleon to remain anywhere near Europe seemed dangerously irresponsible. Even a small chance of another return was considered unacceptable. The government therefore reached a decision that would shape the rest of Napoleon's life. He would not be allowed to stay in Britain. He would not be permitted to travel to America. He would not choose his own destination. Instead, he would be transported to one of the most isolated places under British control. Saint Helena. The island lay in the South Atlantic Ocean, nearly 1,200 miles from the west coast of Africa, and almost 2,000 miles from South America. There were no neighboring countries, no nearby ports, no friendly governments, no realistic escape routes. If Elba had been a prison with an open gate, Saint Helena would become a fortress, surrounded by thousands of miles of ocean. When Napoleon learned of the decision, disappointment quickly turned into anger. He argued that he had surrendered voluntarily. He insisted that he should not be treated like a dangerous criminal. He reminded British officials that he had trusted their honor. His protests changed nothing. The government had already made up its mind. On August 7th, 1815, Napoleon was transferred to another British warship, HMS Northumberland. This vessel would carry him on the long voyage to Saint Helena. Unlike the short journey to Elba, this voyage would last more than 2 months. As the English coastline disappeared behind the ship, Napoleon quietly watched from the deck. He understood that he was leaving Europe forever. He would never again see France, never again walk through the halls of the Tuileries Palace, never again review an army before battle. The world he had shaped for nearly 2 decades was slipping beyond the horizon. Life aboard Northumberland settled into a routine. Napoleon read extensively. He played cards. He walked the deck for exercise. He held long conversations with officers and members of his small household. Sometimes he spoke about famous campaigns. Sometimes he reflected upon mistakes. Observers noticed that his memory remained astonishing. He could recall tiny details from battles fought many years earlier. The position of a single artillery battery, the name of an obscure village, the exact wording of an important order. His mind remained as sharp as ever. Yet there were moments of quiet sadness. He often stood alone at the ship's rail, staring across the endless Atlantic. Those who knew him well sensed that he was beginning to understand the true meaning of permanent exile. This was not another temporary setback. There would be no return. There would be no dramatic comeback. The voyage itself became strangely peaceful. The sea was vast and almost empty. Weeks passed with little change beyond shifting weather and endless waves. For a man who had spent most of his adult life surrounded by urgent decisions and constant movement, the silence must have felt unfamiliar, perhaps even unsettling. At last, in October 1815, dark volcanic cliffs appeared on the horizon. Saint Helena emerged from the ocean like an enormous fortress. Steep mountains rose directly from the sea. Jagged rocks guarded the coastline. Landing places were few. The island looked less like a tropical paradise and more like a prison created by nature itself. Napoleon observed it carefully as the ship approached. There was little to say. The island's isolation spoke for itself. Jamestown, the island's only significant settlement, occupied a narrow valley squeezed between towering cliffs. From the harbor, escape seemed unimaginable. British officials welcomed Napoleon with strict formality. Security arrangements had already been prepared. Thousands of soldiers were stationed on the island. Additional naval patrols circled nearby waters. Watch posts overlooked every possible landing place. Ships approaching Saint Helena would be questioned. Ships leaving would be searched. No detail was considered too small. The British government intended to guarantee that Europe would never again awaken to news that Napoleon had escaped. At first, temporary accommodations were arranged at a small residence called the Briars. The house belonged to the Balcom family. Compared with what would follow, those weeks proved relatively pleasant. Napoleon spent time in the garden. He talked with members of the family. He especially enjoyed conversations with the young Elizabeth Balcom, whose cheerful personality briefly distracted him from the reality of exile. For a short while, life almost resembled ordinary domestic routine, but everyone knew the arrangement was temporary. Work continued on Napoleon's permanent residence, Longwood House. Located high on a windy plateau, Longwood had originally served agricultural purposes before being adapted for Napoleon's use. The building was isolated. The climate was damp. Strong winds swept across the surrounding hills. Mist frequently covered the landscape. Many visitors considered the location unhealthy. When Napoleon finally moved into Longwood House, he immediately noticed its shortcomings. The rooms felt uncomfortable. Moisture affected furniture and walls. Insects became a constant annoyance. Repairs never seemed fully complete. The house lacked the elegance of imperial palaces. It lacked even the modest comfort of Elba. Yet this was where the British expected one of history's greatest rulers to spend the remainder of his life. Every aspect of his existence became regulated. He could not travel freely around the island without permission. His visitors were carefully monitored. Letters were inspected. British sentries watched the roads leading away from Longwood. The governor of Saint Helena, Sir Hudson Lowe, interpreted his instructions with exceptional strictness. Relations between the two men deteriorated almost immediately. Napoleon believed he deserved treatment befitting a former sovereign. Lowe viewed him primarily as a prisoner whose escape must be prevented at all costs. The disagreement poisoned everyday life. Arguments developed over seemingly minor issues: titles, restrictions, visitors, correspondence, household expenses. Nothing remained simple. The atmosphere grew increasingly tense. Napoleon had once governed an empire stretching across much of Europe. Now he debated the timing of walks, the delivery of newspapers, and the condition of household furniture. history can be remarkably unforgiving. The man who had escaped Elba and shocked an entire continent had finally reached a prison from which there would be no second escape. His adventures were over. But another battle had already begun. This time the struggle would not be fought with armies or artillery. It would be fought against isolation, declining health, and the slow passage of time. Longwood House was unlike any place Napoleon Bonaparte had ever called home. There were no cheering crowds outside its gates, no generals waiting for instructions, no ministers bringing urgent reports from Paris, no maps spread across enormous tables showing the movements of armies across Europe. Instead, there was silence. Day after day, the winds of Saint Helena swept across the lonely plateau, carrying little more than the sound of rain against the windows and waves crashing against distant cliffs. For a man who had spent nearly 20 years shaping the destiny of Europe, the quiet was almost unbearable. Yet Napoleon refused to allow history to write his story without his involvement. If he could no longer command armies, he would command memory. Almost immediately, he began dictating his recollections to the loyal companions who had chosen to remain with him. Hour after hour, he described campaigns, political decisions, diplomatic negotiations, and battles that had changed the world. He explained why he had crossed the Alps, why he had marched into Italy, why he had invaded Russia, why he believed Waterloo had been lost. Sometimes he accepted responsibility. Other times he blamed poor decisions by subordinates, bad weather, or simple misfortune. Like every great historical figure, Napoleon understood that history was shaped not only by events, but also by the stories told afterward. Those memoirs became one of his final weapons. He wanted future generations to remember him not as a tyrant defeated by Europe, but as a visionary whose ideas had outlived his empire. Life on Saint Helena settled into a slow and repetitive routine. Napoleon rose late in the morning. He spent hours reading books from his growing library. History fascinated him as much as ever. So did science, philosophy, and literature. He discussed ancient Rome, the campaigns of Alexander the Great, and the governments of Britain and France. Visitors often left amazed by the breadth of his knowledge. His memory remained extraordinary. He could recall dates, names, military formations, and conversations from decades earlier with remarkable accuracy. But while his mind remained sharp, his body slowly began to weaken. The damp climate of Saint Helena affected his health. He complained of fatigue. Persistent stomach pain became increasingly common. Headaches appeared more frequently. His appetite declined. At first, both Napoleon and his companions dismissed these problems as temporary. Months became years. The symptoms gradually worsened. Relations with the island's governor, Sir Hudson Lowe, never improved. The two men distrusted each other completely. Napoleon believed Lowe intentionally made life difficult. Lowe believed Napoleon constantly searched for opportunities to manipulate public opinion, or even attempt another escape. Arguments arose over visitors, over correspondence, over household expenses. Even small disagreements quickly became personal. Neither man was willing to compromise. Isolation deepened. As time passed, Napoleon rarely left Longwood House. He spent increasing amounts of time indoors. Sometimes he walked through the gardens when the weather allowed. Often he remained inside for days. The former emperor, who had once ridden thousands of miles across Europe, now measured his world in the distance between a few familiar rooms. Yet beyond Saint Helena, something unexpected was happening. His legend was growing. Across Europe, opinions about Napoleon slowly began to change. Many people who'd once feared him now viewed him with sympathy. The image of the lonely prisoner on a distant island replaced the image of the conquering emperor. Artists painted romantic portraits. Writers debated his achievements. Veterans shared stories of campaigns fought under his command. His enemies had defeated the man. They had not defeated the myth. Even governments that had opposed him continued using reforms he had introduced. The Napoleonic Code influenced legal systems far beyond France. Administrative reforms survived. Educational institutions endured. Military academies studied his campaigns in extraordinary detail. Generations of officers learned strategy by examining his victories and his mistakes. Napoleon himself knew none of this with certainty. He could only hope that history would judge him fairly. By 1821, his health had deteriorated dramatically. He spent much of his time confined to bed. Doctors disagreed about the exact nature of his illness. Some believed he suffered from chronic liver disease. Others suspected stomach cancer, a disease that had claimed the life of his father. Modern historians and medical researchers continue debating the precise cause of his death. Some theories even suggested arsenic poisoning, although many experts now believe naturally occurring arsenic in wallpaper and other environmental factors may explain the traces later found in samples of his hair. Whatever the cause, Napoleon understood that his life was ending. On May 5, 1821, as rain clouds gathered over Saint Helena, Napoleon Bonaparte died at the age of 51. Those present described his final hours as peaceful. His reported last words have been remembered in several different versions, but one account suggests he whispered the names that had defined his life. France, the army, Josephine. Whether those were his exact final words may never be known. What is certain is that his thoughts remained connected to the people and places that had shaped his remarkable journey. He was buried on Saint Helena beneath a quiet valley, surrounded by willow trees. There was no imperial funeral, no grand military parade, no vast crowds. Only a handful of loyal companions and British officials stood beside the grave. It appeared that the story of Napoleon Bonaparte had finally come to an end. History, however, had one final surprise. 19 years later, in 1840, the French government requested permission to return Napoleon's remains to France. Britain agreed. The body was carefully exhumed and placed aboard the French warship Belle-Poule. As the ship sailed toward France, thousands gathered along the route to honor the man who had once shaken the foundations of Europe. When Napoleon returned to Paris, he was greeted not as a prisoner nor as a defeated emperor, but as a national legend. An immense funeral procession moved through streets crowded with mourners. Veterans who had survived his campaigns stood with tears in their eyes. Young people who had never seen him alive came simply to witness history. Eventually, Napoleon was laid to rest beneath the magnificent dome of Les Invalides in Paris, where millions of visitors continue to pay their respects today. Looking back across 2 centuries, Napoleon's life remains one of history's greatest contradictions. He was a military genius whose ambitions plunged Europe into devastating wars. He was an authoritarian ruler who also introduced legal reforms that strengthened equality before the law. He inspired extraordinary loyalty among his soldiers, while earning the lasting hatred of many governments. To some, he was a liberator. To others, a conqueror. To many, he was both. But one chapter of his life stands apart from all the others. His escape from Elba. It was more than a daring adventure. It was an event that defied every expectation. A defeated emperor escaped from exile, landed with barely 1,000 men, marched hundreds of miles through hostile territory, regained an empire without fighting a major battle, and forced all of Europe into one final war. No other fallen ruler has ever returned to power in quite the same way. His triumph lasted only 100 days. Yet those 100 days became immortal. They transformed Napoleon from a powerful emperor into a timeless legend. Empires rise, empires fall, kings are crowned, kings are overthrown. But only a few individuals leave such a profound mark on history that centuries later, their names still inspire admiration, controversy, debate, and fascination. Napoleon Bonaparte was one of those rare individuals. His empire disappeared. His armies vanished. His throne was lost forever. Yet his influence endured. Perhaps that is the greatest lesson of his extraordinary story. Power can be taken away. Territory can be conquered. Crowns can be removed. But ideas, ambition, and legacy often outlive the people who create them. And that is why, more than 200 years after his final defeat, the world still remembers the man who escaped exile, challenged an entire continent one last time, and secured a place among the most unforgettable figures in human history. The story of Napoleon Bonaparte is not simply the story of an emperor. It is the story of ambition without limits, courage in the face of impossible odds, devastating mistakes, astonishing resilience, and a legacy that continues to shape the modern world. Long after the cannons fell silent and the battlefields returned to grass, one truth remained. History never truly imprisoned Napoleon. It immortalized him.